What chance did a woman have in a naval courtroom where the statutes, the judges, and the assumptions all spoke with the same voice? That piracy was not only unlawful, but unnatural for a woman to commit. The honest answer, preserved in dry ledgers and chilling verdicts, is almost none. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of piracy, British Admiralty courts pursued pirates with relentless certainty, and female defendants were treated as doubly defiant. Offenders against the crown and against the roles society assigned them. Hearings unfolded in improvised tribunals from Jamaica to New Providence. Proceedings without juries, timelines compressed, outcomes seldom in doubt. Witnesses arrived in uniform and in fear, captains, lieutenants, seamen, all eager to distance themselves from suspicion. The accused had counsel in name more than in power. Procedure was brisk. The theater unmistakable. In this system, a few names still echo: Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who stood before the bench in 1720 at Spanish Town, Jamaica. Women who had sailed and fought and concealed their identities until capture made secrecy impossible. When Calico Jack was condemned, Bonny's bitter farewell cut sharper than any sentence. If you had fought like a man, you would not hang like a dog. Their plea, like that of other accused women, was one of the few legal protections available: pregnancy. Pleading the belly did not acquit, it delayed. It recognized a life within, not the life on trial. In their case, the reprieve held only for a time. For most women, there was no such interlude. The verdict arrived as swiftly as the indictment, and the gavel simply confirmed what the courtroom had already decided. The river that curled past Wapping carried ships toward the sea. But on certain mornings, its current bore witness to another kind of procession. From Newgate Prison, carts rumbled over cobblestones, guarded by soldiers and flanked by curious crowds. Inside sat those condemned by the Admiralty, bound for the gallows at Execution Dock. The scene became ritual, one designed to impress itself on memory. Chains rattling, drums beating, faces pressed against windows to glimpse the spectacle. For men, the charges were familiar. For women, rarer, but no less severe. The journey was weighted with layers of disbelief. That a woman had dared to live as a pirate was already scandalous. That she now sat under guard, condemned, was meant to shock and instruct in equal measure. British law left no uncertainty. The Piracy Act of 1698 declared the crime punishable by death for all and every person who defied the Crown's authority at sea. At Execution Dock, the gallows stood close enough to the Thames that the tide lapped beneath it, as if to claim those who had once used the water for freedom. The symbolism was pointed. Piracy was born of the sea, and the sea itself would be witness to its punishment. Before the noose, many women met another sentence: the lash. Flogging was one of the oldest punishments in naval tradition, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, it became a common tool against those accused of piracy. For women, it carried an added layer of spectacle. Their suffering was not hidden away in a cell, but brought before the public, where each strike was intended to sting not only flesh, but reputation. The body became the page upon which authority wrote its warning. The instrument was the cat o' nine tails, a whip made of multiple knotted cords. Each lashed her skin, leaving marks that lingered for days, sometimes forever. Sentences varied: a dozen strokes for lesser offenses, or stretches of punishment that climbed into the hundreds. Executions ended life. Flogging carved fear into the living. The sound itself, the crack of cord against flesh, was as much a message as the scars it left. Crowds gathered eagerly. The punishment was carried out on docks, in markets outside prison gates. Children were present. Merchants paused their trade. Women leaned from windows. All watched as the condemned was tied and struck, their cries mingling with the salt air. For female pirates, this public humiliation was sharpened by gender. It was not only defiance of law that was punished, but defiance of role. A woman who had fought aboard a ship, commanded a crew, wielded a pistol, was shown stripped of power, reduced to a warning before all who saw. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, imprisoned after their capture in 1720, were kept in harsh conditions while awaiting trial. Though direct records of flogging are absent in their case, many women elsewhere endured it. In the American colonies, in the Caribbean, and in ports along the West Indies, The whip was as present as the gallows. Sometimes it was used to extract confessions. Sometimes it was the sentence itself. Always it was meant to degrade. Naval authorities understood the symbolism. The lash was not final. It left survivors. But those survivors carried the Empire's message wherever they went. A scarred back was a visible reminder of disobedience punished. For women, the humiliation was doubled. Their wounds told the crowd not only of law enforced but of gender corrected. An attempt to force them back into the mold society demanded. For the audience, the scene was both punishment and performance. Gasps and murmurs rippled with each strike. The condemned swayed, clung to the post, sometimes fainted, sometimes remained defiantly silent. But whether they cried out or stayed mute, the result was the same. They became a spectacle for others to learn from. The lash was a teacher, and its lessons were cruelly clear. What mattered most was not the pain itself, but the display. Justice in these moments was not a private affair. It was theater, and like any performance, it required witnesses. The Empire ensured that crowds were present, that memory was spread. No one could say they had not seen what the crown did to those who dared to live as pirates, especially women. And so the whip became as much a part of Empire as the noose. It carried the same message in a different key. Control, order, authority. It left behind not just wounds, but silence. For those who endured it, the marks on their bodies became permanent reminders of a world where defiance was crushed. Not only in death, but in the very fabric of the skin. Here's a history hot tip for you. Not every woman captured at sea met her fate at the gallows or under the lash. Some vanished into quieter, less visible forms of punishment. Their freedom was exchanged for forced labor or coerced companionship. In the Caribbean, in the markets of West Africa, in the towns of the Americas, female prisoners were sometimes absorbed into systems of concubinage or slavery. Though records are often fragmentary, what survives suggests a pattern. Women taken as spoils. Their identities stripped, their stories silenced. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, where privateering, piracy, and slavery blurred into one another, captured women were often processed as property. Ships seized near Portobello or Cartagena recorded the presence of women, some listed as captives, others as crew. In either case, their fate was similar. They were transferred into households, plantations, or garrisons, treated not as defendants to be tried, but as commodities to be distributed. The Empire's law intersected with its economy, and both demanded obedience. Race and class deepened the divide. Black and mixed-race women found aboard pirate vessels were often presumed to be enslaved already, regardless of their actual status. Colonial officials rarely asked whether they had chosen piracy or been forced into it. Their lives folded into plantation economies, absorbed into domestic labor, or claimed by officials who saw them as personal spoils. In such cases, the line between punishment and exploitation dissolved. What mattered was not guilt or innocence, but availability. And so the women disappeared. For some, the end did not come in the courtroom at the gallows, or even in the hidden confines of servitude. Instead, it came slowly, quietly, and far from the public eye, on the hulks of prison ships. These floating jails, anchored in harbors from Portsmouth to Kingston, were relics of warships stripped of sails and left to decay. By the 18th century, when land-based prisons overflowed, they became the Crown's answer to the problem of confinement. For captured pirates, men and women alike, these vessels were often the last horizon. Conditions aboard were unbearable. Prisoners were chained in cramped holds where air barely circulated and light rarely reached. Food was scarce, water often foul, disease spread rapidly, carried in the breath of the sick and the bites of vermin. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox claimed lives faster than the rope. For women, vulnerability doubled. In addition to hunger and illness, they faced exploitation and mistreatment by guards or sailors, abuses rarely written into records, but whispered in testimony and hinted at in official reports. Unlike executions, which were staged as public warnings, the prison ships enforced a quieter punishment. Those confined, they disappeared from view. They were not paraded before crowds or memorialized in broadsheets, simply faded into absence, swallowed by the stench and darkness below deck. For the Empire, this too was effective. A hanged pirate might inspire tales. A vanished one left nothing but silence. The symbolism was stark. Execution dock taught fear through spectacle. The prison ships taught fear through forgetting. The sea that once promised freedom now pressed against the timbers of rotting vessels, a constant reminder of captivity. The same waters that had carried these women toward rebellion now held them still, their lives measured in tides and disease rather than storms and cannon fire. Official records mention them only in passing, if at all. A line noting prisoners transferred to a ship, a tally of rations distributed, a burial count when disease swept through the decks. Names are scarce. Details are fewer still. Absence is deliberate. To record would be to acknowledge. An acknowledgement risked memory. The state preferred erasure. For those who perished aboard, death was not sudden but drawn out. Weakness set in slowly. Fevers rose. Voices dimmed. The end came without witnesses, save for the other prisoners who watched and knew their turn might follow. No crowd cheered. No magistrate pronounced judgment. Only silence, punctuated by the creak of timbers and the splash of water against hull. What remains is not their stories, but their absence. The Empire wrote its authority as much through forgetting as through punishment. The Gallows shouted its lesson. Prison ships whispered theirs. Together they told the same truth. Women who defied both sea and society would not be allowed to endure, whether in legend or in life. And yet, the echo of their defiance lingers. In the silence of forgotten decks, in the gaps of the record books, in the unease that comes from erasure, we sense the outlines of lives once lived against the current. They remind us that punishment is not only the rope or the lash, sometimes it is disappearance, carefully constructed, designed to leave nothing but questions. Their stories fragmented, partial, often erased, still ask us, what does it mean when history chooses silence? What does it say about power, about justice, and about who is remembered? The answers lie not only in the sentences delivered centuries ago, but in the silence that followed, a silence that was never an accident.